Good evening and welcome back to the Masonic Roundtable, a weekly program where Masons from around the world get together to talk Masonic news and opinions in a friendly and social manner. As a reminder, the thoughts and opinions expressed here are solely the opinions of the participants and do not reflect any Grand Lodge statements or positions. Remember to keep your conversations open to the public and on the level. To interact with us, send questions and comments to our Twitter page at Mason Roundtable, on our Facebook event page for episode 198, Pardes Exegesis, or in the chat running right alongside this YouTube video. I'm your host for tonight. John's out of town. My name is Jason Richards. I am the past master of Acacia Lodge number 16 in Clifton, Virginia, and member of the Colonial Lodge number 1821 in Washington, D.C. Let's move on to Mike the Intern.
Hello, Mike Ambrecht here from Village Lodge number 274 in Burton, Ohio, and Triandria number 780, where I am the junior steward and lodge education officer.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, Mike. Robert Johnson.
Hey, Robert Johnson here, Waukegan Lodge number 78, Waukegan, Illinois, past master, current sitting secretary, and a DDGM for the 1st Northeastern District, state of Illinois.
Awesome. Glad you're here, Robert.
Thanks, buddy.
And last but not least, our special guest for tonight. You know him as a podcaster on X-Oriente and a frequent guest on the Masonic Roundtable. Brother Eric Diamond, please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Eric Diamond. I am the host of X-Oriente, actually one of the two hosts of X-Oriente, a past master of Oriental Lodge number 33 in Chicago, and a member of Union Lodge number 6 in the Great District of Columbia, and a member of IRA number 2 in New York.
Awesome. Glad to have you with us, Eric. Thanks so much for lending your expertise and wisdom to this show.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Great. We're going to kick things off with Masonic news. First up, as we've mentioned before, if you were with us for our 300th anniversary celebration, you know that we have patents ready to go. And so you can go and check those out at thewindingstairs.com or freemasonryart.com. And we've got the TMR 300th anniversary commemorative patent by artist and brother Ryan J. Flynn. You can own a piece of history. And they're going through one, and he's supposed to be shipping those out soon to those who have ordered it. So check that out. Also, next up on Masonic News, it's a little light tonight, but we're going to plug AMD Masonic Week again. It's coming to you the 8th through the 10th of February. And who's going to be there? Eric, you're going to be there pretty much all week, aren't you?
Yeah, I will be there. I'll be arriving on Wednesday afternoon, and I will be there through Sunday. So good times. It's my favorite part of the Masonic year.
Yeah, no, it's always a fun time, and it's fun because you get to go and hang out with folks as opposed to sitting in the sessions. So I know your colleague and partner in crime, Brother Jason Van Dyke, is going to be there as well. And Mike the Intern, John Rourke, and I are all going to be there. We'll be there for Mike will be there quite a bit that week, right?
Yes, I will. Yeah, that's my plan. Yep.
And I'm bringing a boatload of equipment, so we'll be able to live stream and record, and so hopefully we'll have a lot of crossover, a lot of crossing the streams.
Don't cross the streams. So yeah, John and I will be there definitely Saturday, probably Thursday evening as well, and we'll try to all get together and record some good stuff for everybody.
And a little bit of a can I plug something?
No, please.
I'm going to be giving the address at the Masonic Society dinner, and it's going to be a bit of a grenade thrower. So if you want to hear a little bit of controversy, this will be a good one.
What night's the dinner?
That'll be Friday night.
Okay.
Should be good times.
I may have to come.
I may not be a Mason on Saturday morning, but we'll see.
Yeah, man. You gotta watch it, dude. You know, if you go against the status quo, you bring up something somebody doesn't like. It should be awesome, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good luck.
No, we can't wait to hear it, and we can't wait for you to talk about it for those of us who miss it on an upcoming episode of X-Oriente.
Mhm.
All right. Screaming through Masonic news. Just a reminder, February 6th is our 200th anniversary episode. So already to episode 200, which is kind of crazy. And we're going to do it on Shriners International. So that's one of our most listener requested topics. So we're going to actually bite the bullet and do it. So with that, let's get into to tonight's topic. So we've talked about Masonic research in past episodes of the Masonic Roundtable. We've done kind of an introduction to research, kind of empirical research versus anecdotal research. And one of the things that Eric Diamond and I were talking about at a couple Masonic weeks ago was the idea of interpretation, and how there are a lot of folks who stop with the literal interpretation of whether it be a mystical text or a piece of Masonic ritual. And what a lot of folks don't understand is that there are a bunch of different layers of interpretation, and there's actually a specific exegesis method, which is a critical explanation or interpretive method of a text, usually a religious text or the Bible, that actually goes through the different ways you can look at the same historical text, and it gives you some good rules and guidelines for interpreting not only the literal interpretation, but the contextual and the allegorical and the mystical. So we figured that this would be a fantastic topic to bring to you all, to say, hey, as we're looking at Freemasonry and looking at the ritual and what folks have written about the ritual, how can we go deeper, and how can we not just stop at kind of what's on the page. So with that, I'm going to let Brother Eric lead off in just a discussion about the Pardes method, what it is, and where it came from.
So the Pardes method, well, let's start with the word Pardes. So the word Pardes literally means orchard or garden, and it's from a Persian word, and it actually is the root of the word paradise, meaning like garden as in Garden of Eden. And so the idea is that it was a reference in the Kabbalah to encountering the divine in this sort of like, they would say, oh, the rabbis entered the garden. And so people took that to mean that they, somehow, had this sort of revelatory experience where they sort of transcended their bodies or whatever. The truth of what that really was is that Pardes has a hidden meaning, which is it's an acronym. And so Hebrew has no vowels. It's only consonants. And so the way that you spell the word Pardes is Pei, Resh, Daled, Shin. So it's PRDS, Pardes. And it has a specific meaning, and that it's an acronym, and that acronym is the method by which you sort of examine a text in different ways in order to fully understand it. So the four methods are the P stands for Pshat, which means the literal meaning of a text. The R stands for Remez, which means the allegorical meaning of the text. D means Drash, which is the interpreted meaning of a text. And then Shin, S stands for Sod, which means the hidden meaning of a text or the mystical meaning of a text. And so by looking at those aspects of a particular piece of text in order, it's important to do it in order. by looking at them in order, you get a much more complete understanding of what that text can teach you. So here we're looking at the acronym, right? Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. And so it's a really, what I found is really interesting. So I've studied Kabbalah for many years, and what this method does, the reason it's special, the reason it's I think it's a really good way of understanding a text, is that it helps ground you in the text itself, and it helps keep you honest in a way. One of the things that I notice, especially like in groups, like, you'll see this in like the Winding Stairs and some of the other Masonic groups on Facebook, is that there's some really out there interpretations of text, and they're not really grounded in any sort of context. They're not really grounded in any sort of discipline. They're just sort of like, like a perfect example. There was a thread last week. Was Jesus a Mason? And there was all this like speculation of, oh, well, yeah, he was for this reason or that reason, but none of it was grounded in any sense of scholarship. So it can't really, like without, with this method, you because you have a grounding before you get to the mystical part, it kind of keeps you honest in that mystical aspect.
What I find interesting, Eric, is this idea that the first part of it, so in the P, you talk a little bit about the literal interpretation. And if you could speak to that a little bit, because even that first step is one step, because you said, everybody likes to take this stuff at literal meaning, but even that first step in this system is a step beyond what most people do, because that first step requires them to put historical context into it, if I'm not mistaken. And that's something that most people who read text today, whether it's the Bible or whatever their holy book is, or even in ritual, there is a huge disconnect with what something meant when it was written and what it meant today. And it seems like the first step in this system actually assumes that you've applied historical context, which is not typically most people do.
No, it's true. It's true. And it's especially important when the older the text is. So I'll give you an example of where like Pshat can radically change your understanding of a text. So we read in the New Testament, right, about the Virgin Mary, right? And the word virgin, right, in Aramaic there's two different words for virgin, right? There's alma, which means maiden, and that refers to a bride, right? So if you were going to get married, they would refer to the bride as the alma. And then there's betula, which means virgin, as in someone who never had sex before, right? And so in Greek, you don't have two words for that. You have, I can't remember the exact word in Greek, but it comes from the root parthenos, right, which means virgin. And so virgin, the word virgin goes down in history when you read it in Greek and Latin as having one meaning, whereas in the original Aramaic it had two meanings. And so when you understand that context and go back to the original source word and look at the root of the word and where the word comes from, it can have a radical difference in how you interpret that text.
Yeah, and I think in that specific instance, it's really interesting. Like I've heard several arguments that point to the historical context in which that's written. The word literally doesn't mean someone who hasn't had sex. It's used in the sense of a young maiden, like you said.
Yeah, and so it doesn't necessarily mean that later on you're not going to get there. You're not going to get to sort of this miraculous place.
Right.
It's not there to like challenge your faith or anything like that, but it's there to give you additional context. So one of the things, like for example, when when I'm looking at a text, and to kind of bring this back into Masonry, for example, the word hail, right? What is that word? Where does it come from? Why do we use that word and not another word? Understanding like the literal meaning and what that word brings to the overall equation helps ground you in a foundation, so that at least you're not interpreting it in the incorrect way. So at least you know what the intent was when it was written.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think it's one of those things where so much of what we read, and again, as you mentioned, even in Masonry, so much can be lost in translation just because there's a specific context that goes along with the vernacular that we're just not in tune with today. One of the things that I personally found really interesting about the Pardes method is that it's interpretation isn't a free for all, and there are actually specific rules in place in the Pardes method that guide the bounds of your interpretation. For example, when you have darash or midrash, which is essentially it's a it means kind of the concept behind things. A darash understanding cannot be used to strip a passage of its peshat meaning. So your interpretation can't go back and alter the face value of the text. Another rule is the primary components of an allegory represent specific realities, and we should limit ourselves to these primary concepts when we understand the text. And then the last rule is kind of let Scripture interpret Scripture, which is you shouldn't be looking outside of the text per se for some greater allegory. It should be confined within the realms of the text. And I think it's just really cool to see a research method that puts bounds on interpretation. So someone can't be like, well, the sprig of acacia is emblematical of long life, but I drove over a sprig of acacia today and it broke, and so that's my life breaking into pieces. I mean, it's going well outside of the original bounds of the allegory.
Yeah, and we see that a lot, especially in I call them like some of the more speculative Masonic books, right? So they'll say things like here's this Masonic concept, and the pharaohs had a similar concept. So that means that the pharaohs must have been Masons. And if that's the case, then if the it's like each one of those interpretations is based on an if-then concept. And then you link the first to the last, and nothing is grounded anymore. It's just, you've built a very delicate tinker toy that doesn't hold up under its own weight, because you've based your interpretation on these suppositions and these connections that that can't be traced back into the peshat. For example, the allegorical meaning can't conflict with the literal meaning, and the interpreted meaning can't conflict with either the peshat or the rimaz. It's a build. And so that's how you know that you're on firm footing. It's because if you can get all the way out to Sod, having done the work of the first three steps, that you're on some pretty firm footing. And this is where like the kind of Kabbalah that I study is in a lot of ways very different than something like a Hermetic Kabbalah, where they're trying to kind of link it to other things in alchemy and stuff like that weren't necessarily part of the original text. So you don't have that sort of grounding. You're sort of making connections and meeting in the middle, as opposed to building up a foundation. And so what I find is that like Kabbalah for me it's very down to earth. It's very practical. It's, it has strategies that I can use every day in my work and life. It's not something, I think a lot of times when you're looking at sort of, esoteric texts and even Masonic text and teaching, is that it becomes so like out there that it doesn't, it's not really useful to inform your everyday life and decisions. And I think when we fail at that, that's when the whole thing kind of falls apart. If all it's good for is these crazy kind of, I don't want to say crazy, but these like way out there speculations, right? And it can't really inform us every day, then what are we doing?
Well, I mean, it kind of goes against what Masonry is in general, which is a brotherhood designed to make ourselves better every single day. So if we're studying these mystical concepts and can't readily apply them, then in a lot of ways there's not much use for them in the fraternity.
Yeah, exactly.
What I find interesting about a lot of these like kind of mystical interpretations and things that people will write, they're written in this real kind of spacey, spacey words and such, right? And it's like, how many times have you guys started to read this kind of stuff and you're like, this is really difficult to understand. I don't even know what they're saying. I mean, I've read entire books and put it down and went, I'm not sure that book said one thing, one fact.
I told you not to read Morals and Dogma.
Oh boy. Send hate mail too. But yeah,
but I'll give you a more contemporary example. So without naming names, there was a book about the psychology of Freemasonry, right? And when I read that book, I was really excited. I was really into this because I'm like, oh, we're going to learn about psychology, and what it turned out to be was more mysticism linkage to Masonry. And what I found very little of was actual psychology. And so that to me was like where you went right from Peshat to Sod, and you didn't like the Drosh and the Remez were completely missing from that book. And I found it personally very disappointing.
So, kind of switching gears here, we've skirted around it a little bit, and we've talked about places where Pardes wasn't used in Masonic research and writings, where perhaps it should have been. Mike the intern, how could a research method like Pardes be used in the context of Masonic scholarship and even writing posts on Facebook?
Well, the idea is that when you with the rules of this, you kind of are trying to look at a deeper level of the meaning of everything. So, I mean, honestly, people can say things on Facebook that, we know, like if they capitalize everything, it's, you read it on the surface, they're angry, but you know what? Maybe they're really not if you take away the caps, you have to look at the words, look at what they're saying, and look at how it feels, And the same thing applies to when you're reading, you're doing your research for anything Masonic, read what it means and understand the beginning of it first. What it's telling you on a base level. Then, you have to take a look at the hints of what's deeper. Take another look at the inquisitive and comparative nature of the wording, and then obviously at some point you're looking to see what was secret underneath here without changing the overall original meaning. Because if you go way beyond what the original meaning was in a classic sense and just totally are off the wall, yeah, you're off the wall and you're not on track. But you have to keep it within a bounds, and that's what Pardes really is about, trying to do that from my perspective. So.
Yeah, and you brought up a really interesting point, which is this idea of sensing intent, right? So a lot of times, in research, we come to it with like a preconceived notion, or where we're trying to make a linkage to something, and we're looking for those hooks that are going to enable us to build that bridge without sensing the intent of the original text. And sometimes the intent is very different, and sometimes it's even opposed to the mystical interpretation, and that's okay, provided you've done that homework. But when you don't have that and you don't sense the intent, that intent is going to inform how you interpret it. Does that make sense?
Exactly. Yes, it does. That's exactly it. Because, yeah, I mean, obviously a lot of the way the rule is written is that, it shouldn't be totally opposite, but you're right, it can, and really whenever you're doing your research on Masonic writings and so forth, and ideas, especially symbolism, you can get down to a point where, well, you know what, that doesn't exactly mean what you think it means, So,
Yeah. There's a story they tell in the Kabbalah about the 4 rabbis who enter the garden, and one of them, they all behold the mystical throne, which is like the tree of life, and one of them just immediately dies, right? And one of them goes insane, and one of them, it said poison the shoots, and the 4th one, Rabbi Akiva, enters in peace and leaves in peace. And if you don't know how to read that story, it makes very little sense, or you can kind of read into it whatever you want. But to understand how the 3rd rabbi poisoned the shoots, you have to know the life story of Rabbi Ben Abuya, right? And to understand what it means to have died, right? So, many people, like, they'll just say, oh, well, he beheld God's face, and, nobody can live by seeing God's face. But what it really means, when you actually go back and you look at the way in which the words are put together, it's almost like sarcasm, right? They're saying, they say in the scripture, of it, God, God weeps for his innocent ones, which basically means this guy was totally unprepared when he entered the garden. He was totally not grounded, and that's why he was annihilated, right? Because he was just not, grounded, right? He couldn't handle it, right? So you have to know that background. You have to know that underlying intent in order to understand fully the text.
And even with the 3rd one, wasn't his intent wasn't it more evil, and that's why his name got changed too, and all that?
Well, so yeah, so except that when you read the story, so his name was Elisha Ben Abuya, and he was a very advanced thinker, and his reputation was such that they called him Acher, which means the other. They couldn't even say his name. He was such a heretic. But what was his crime? His crime was he realized that there was parts of the divine in us. And because of that, he interpreted that to mean that we were all divine. Right? And that was his heresy, was that he equated man with God. And that, so, could you have some sympathy for the guy? Yes, you could, because he was interpreting it the way he saw it, and maybe other people were misinterpreting it, or maybe he had the wrong interpretation, but it came from a good place. So in his case, in Acher's case, it was sort of a sin of ignorance, not necessarily one of evil, not of evil intent. And so what the lesson there is that you could have really good intentions and still wind up doing great evil, right? Watch out. Right. And so, like, all of that, like, again, all that, you have this mystical meaning of beholding the glory of the tetragrammaton, right? Beholding that glory and knowing what the literal text is, but without those 2 things in the middle, without knowing the backstory of this guy and how to interpret it, the mystical meaning doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Okay, that makes sense there.
So Robert, talk to us a little bit about perhaps what this means when we try to look at symbolic interpretation in Masonry. I mean, everything from the memento mori to the sprig of acacia. How can we kind of use this method to foster our own personal interpretation of symbols?
So it's an interesting way to look at it. I mean, Pardes is totally new to me, as described here. Typically, my research, whenever I'm looking for these things, is I'm looking at oldest known usage and looking at where we can, where we have these things that are defined. So if we see a symbol of, let's say, I'll use that acacia, right? So let's look at the first usage of acacia or something similar. And then I'm looking for texts where people of authority in their day were talking about these things. And so I tend to utilize this technique of going through and finding actual resources where, again, people of authority, whether those were, in those days with these kind of things, you're looking at, the very educated folks. Usually it was a lot in the clergy, or in religious schools, whatever. And you can compile, all of what they say, and then you can kind of move along and see where it's made changes, whether that's in a great example of how to dive deep into this stuff, and super simple for anybody out there that wants to try this, is look up constellations and astrology. You go from Babylonian to Egyptian, and the Babylonian goes from like Aries is a perfect example, which starts off as a representation of a Babylonian myth of a great worker or a hired hand, which then turns into a ram's head, which is then used as a representation of Amun-Ra. Like, see how this is what Eric was talking about, just kind of stringing it along, right? Like, how far can you get away from it originally? And so you really have to know the facts. This is why this is like, it's kind of interesting. Anybody who's never studied this stuff, or had a way, or had to write a paper, it's why citations is important, right? Like, I've written papers before, and I've had people tell me, you need more authority on this. And I'm like, what do you mean I need more authority on this? Like, you gotta list some sources. You gotta show me where, you're pulling your information from and why you're coming up with these wild, nutty ideas. And I think that this method really would speak to that. Specifically, the part, I have to pull up my Google Drive here really quick on our notes here, but the one that really speaks to what I'm having to do a lot of the time is Darash. Did I say that correctly? Like, just okay. So, which says the comparative meaning, right? So I'm looking at a lot of comparative, and then from that's kind of when we can look at this idea of sod, or this the mystery. So the mystery tends to happen when we look at it and we say, well, this is the largest, like, interpretive part that's so frustrating within Freemasonry, is you have an entire school of wisdom that we are, that literally has no dogma, no official dogma. So people like to say, oh, Masonry is a lot of different things to a lot of different folks. And when we say something like that, it really speaks to me. When I hear that, I think, oh, so we don't know anything about what we teach. It's just whatever, and, willy-nilly. And so I think, like, if we apply something like Pardes to the entire system of Masonry, it could be potentially dangerous. You could end up with some real facts and some real lessons that, could present themselves regarding symbols or regarding practice that not everybody's going to agree with. I mean, you by doing this, you could actually end up with a dogma for Freemasonry, which, I mean, personally, I would welcome, but I don't know, man. It's difficult to say for me.
You could, and let me just build on that for a second, because one of the things that I love about Freemasonry is just the fact that it does not have dogma, which means that it's a living system, right? And that we can interpret it in every age. Like the people who came up with the Talmud and the Zohar, they knew that, you know, the Torah is written. It's there. You know, you have to copy it letter by letter. It does not change. And but times change, people change, knowledge changes, and so you need a way to sort of bring that text into the present day. And Pardes lets you do that. And here's an example of something that drives me absolutely crazy in Masonry, right? But whenever I see a square and compasses with a skull in the middle of it, it drives me up a wall, right? Because if you take the symbol of the square and compasses and you apply a Pardes methodology to interpreting that, right? It's the intersection of virtue, right? And the intersection of circumspection. And if you apply that to the Kabbalistic structure, right? You've got virtue, which is sort of like, you know, loving kindness. That's the column where, you know, Chochmah and Chesed lives, right? And Netzach, right? And then you have the compasses, which sort of speak to circumscription, which is about judgment and about holding back, right? And so that's where you have Bina and Hod and Gevurah, right? And what's in the middle of that, right? Well, the middle of that are the synthesis parts of the tree of life, right? So we either leave that blank to symbolize that it's a mystery, like, you know, God is unseen, or sometimes there's a star in it which represents light, or sometimes we put a G in there, right, which represents the synthesis of virtue and judgment, right? And so when we stick a skull in there, right, now, is a skull a symbol of Masonry? Yeah, it is. It's memento mori. It reminds us to live today, because we're going to die soon, right? But to stick that in the middle of the square and compasses, right, to me is again, it's taking a cool symbol and a cool symbol and kind of mashing them up together without any real understanding of, like, what is that meaning of the synthesis between the square and the compasses, right? Because people don't really examine that. They just sort of take it at face value. You put a skull in the square and compasses and it looks, you know, it's a cool biker symbol. It looks badass, right? But what is it saying? It's saying that the intersection of virtue and circumspection is death. You know, like, it's just, you know, or even if it's memento mori, right? It's the wrong thing in the wrong place to me, right? So, like, that's when I did that sort of exegesis on the symbolism of the square and compasses. That's kind of how I net it out. So now when I see a skull inside the square and compasses, it just grates on me, because I'm like, no, that's not what virtue plus circumspection gets you.
I am never showing you my Dave Bacon past masters apron. Yeah, you're just never going to see that.
All right, I'm never going to show you my apron from Juan.
I think we've all been triggered.
I see his point, though. Honestly, I do.
No, and that's just one little example where if you apply the right research methodology, you can turn, you know, the foundation of people's conceptions about a given symbol or a given allegory right on its head. And that's really the power of research.
Yeah, and it's a good, like, you can do this with any, you know, just pick a Masonic symbol, right? You can, you know, or pick a lecture, or pick a part of the ritual, or a part of the ceremonies that are part of the degrees, right? You could take anything in there and you apply it to that. And what's what I find is really most exciting is when you get to the Drosh stage, because what Drosh says is, what does this teach us for today? What are we to take away from this? Right. And that's where it starts to get really interesting, right? Because, the beehive, teaches us industry and stuff like that. But like when you start getting into stuff like the plum or the gavel or that 24-inch gauge, there's a lot to unpack there.
Well, and that's where the the practical application sets in, and all of a sudden, the abstract is rendered tangible, and you're like, oh, okay, so this is how I can make these daily improvements to my life that all these Masons told me I'd be able to do, when I was petitioning.
Yeah, exactly.
So, question for everybody. In some ways, it might not even be our place to do this, but how do we encourage others, those Masonic writers, those aspiring Masonic writers on Facebook? How do we encourage others to take a deeper look at Masonry, even those in our own lodges? Mike, the intern, being a lodge education officer, how would you go about encouraging your brethren to start looking at kind of the finer points of Masonic ritual and allegories?
Well, just from my own little bit of experience at it, the way that I would do it first is kind of show them. I mean, if they don't know, you could sit there and say, look, if you do it this way, you're going to find deeper meanings. They're going to look at you and go, what deeper meanings? So you kind of have to lead them down the path at least once or twice. You have to show them, how a symbol goes deeper, or, just any piece of it. You have to take some piece and lead them down the path so they get the idea. And then from there, they can then figure out how to follow that path themselves. At least that's just from my own experience on that.
No, that makes sense. Robert.
So I think it's an interesting question to ask. I mean, first of all, you have to identify something that's kind of hard to identify, which is your audience. It's very rare that anybody's going to look deeper. It's just the nature of our fraternity today that there's a lot of people that are in Freemasonry that are in it not for really the teachings, but rather the relationships they form and what they learn from those other men. And that's their, good men becoming better. The surface lessons of our tools, our working tools, are just that. I mean, the 24-inch gauge, manage my time really well. So, are they going to want to get deeper than that? I don't know. But for the most part, I would say that a lot of the guys watching this show, a lot of the guys that interact on these Facebook groups are thirsty for this kind of thing. Providing them the necessary tools to be able to go after this, right? So if you have a good system of taking you through, A to Z on what boxes to check, you go through, and if you can kind of show them a simple system like this, I think it makes it a lot easier. And then if you're more inclined to, if you don't want to do deep dives into maybe symbolism or the mystical, maybe there's something else that you want to try, some other research method. I mean, I know Scott Duvall, Midnight Freemasons post this last year did one. It was basically a Lutheran approach to ritual, in which he goes over how the Lutheran Church teaches to interpret Scripture, which, is just very quickly, it's contextual examination, literary and historical, the principle of analogy, Scripture in light of Scripture, which is like remaining faithful to the broader message of the text than picking and choosing, and then assigning some value or some elements of the text in the way they're given. So like triaging the values. So, Masonically, is my duty more incumbent upon charity, or is it more, striking a brother, or whatever it's going to be? Like, how do you define that kind of stuff? So depending on the system that works for some people and what they're into, but I think if you can manage to give them some sort of vehicle to get to where they want to go, if they want to get deeper, then that's step one. But you're not going to be able to make a horse drink if you can lead them to water, but you can't make them drink, right? And I think it's the same thing with a lot of the Masonic research. So if you got a thirsty lodge, awesome. If you don't, I guess maybe the question might be, how do you intrigue them? That's probably an episode for a future date.
No, and I love what you talked about there with Scott's article. Pardes is not the research method. It's a research method, and what we're trying to do here is give brethren tools to dive deeper and do their own research. And you might find parts of this that come natural to you, and parts of it that you just can't seem to wrap your head around. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. So Eric, for brethren who are interested in exploring more about Kabbalah and Pardes in particular, do you have any resources you'd recommend?
Not discrete ones. Like, there's no like book of Pardes, and in fact, it's something that I always thought maybe one day when I had some time I might write it. But I'll to answer the previous question, which was like, how do you work on this and do this better? My take on this is work in groups. Masonry is not a solitary pursuit, right? It's a group pursuit. You need other people. So, one thing that I would say is work with a partner, right? And hammer that out. And I'll illustrate that with two stories. One you're already familiar with, and one you might not be familiar with. The one you're familiar with is the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel, right? And it's always this mystery, like why would God come and wrestle with a mortal, right? But that wrestling was not the allegorical meaning was sort of like, God wrestling with man, but the interpreted meaning is that this wrestling was intellectual wrestling, right? And by each party not letting go of the other, it created kind of a safe space for each to struggle with this question with the knowledge that neither was going to abandon the other, right? So they wrestle all night until they exhaust themselves, and then God blesses Jacob and says, you will be called Israel because you have struggled with God and prevailed, right? So by staying committed to each other and working through it, as opposed to like arguing to win points, you're arguing to understand, right? So by doing that, you're creating an environment where you're both going to learn something. And then the other story that illustrates this is one of my favorite Kabbalistic stories. So the story goes that there are these four rabbis and they're arguing this point of law. And Rabbi Eliezer says, if what's that? Sorry.
Nope, you're good. Keep going.
Okay. So
four rabbis walk into a bar.
Four rabbis walk into a bar. They're all arguing on this point of law. Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right, let the walls declare it. And the walls start to shake. Right. And the other three are like, that doesn't tell you anything. What the hell do walls know about Torah? Right. And Rabbi Eliezer says, fine. If I'm right, let the liquor in the bottles say it, and the corks all pop off the bottles and start to spill over, right? And Rabbi Eliezer says, see, and the sage says, what do bottles know of Torah? And then he says, if if I'm right, let the heavens declare it. And at that moment, God's voice booms out and says, what do you guys want from me? Rabbi Eliezer is always right. And the rabbis then look up to heaven and say, hey, the Torah is not in heaven, which means, butt out. You gave this to us to interpret. You have no business interpreting the Torah, butt out. And it's said, it's written here. Let me, I have to get the quote. The quote is, this is a great one. It says, let's see. So he said, at that moment, the Almighty laughed and said, my children have defeated me. Right. So by saying this, like basically butt out to the Almighty, right? God's like, they're right. Like, it's not for me to decide. It's for them to decide. And that's, and just the idea that he laughed, right? I just think is a great thing. So it's this idea that we can have these discussions, we can have these interpretations, we can do this kind of work in a spirit of joy, and that being wrong or coming to a different conclusion is not an admission of weakness. It's a sign of advancement. It's a sign of learning. Right. And so one of the things that, like, one of my favorite activities is when I go to Masonic Week is if I'm lucky enough to be with Rex Hutchins, right, who's one of the greatest Masonic scholars ever. Right. I argue with that guy all the time. Right. And people around me are like, what are you doing? That's Rex Hutchins. And I'm like, yeah, but so what? Like, we're both learning something. So that's what I would say is like you work in groups, right? So I would say, like, for people who want to, to do more of this, do a Google search on Pardes. There's a lot of good articles that just sort of explain the basics of it. And that's really all you need. Then go find a partner, go find a brother, and start to, pick your favorite Masonic symbol and just go through it and just start and start working it.
No, that's great advice. And, for those of you who are looking for a place to start, after the show, I'll put up some links in the show notes, and that'll give you a good place to just do some introductory research into Pardes. So it's getting late in the hour, and there wasn't a whole lot on social media outside of Brother Michael Overturf. Thanks so much for all of your comments. We've already taken care of your big question. So let's go ahead and wrap things up with final thoughts, shameless plug, snide remarks, and we'll go to Robert to start us off.
Going to Robert for snide No, I'm kidding.
I said that on purpose.
I know. So, always fascinating. I love having Eric on because when we have him on, he is a veritable expert, whether he wants to admit it or not, on the topics that he talks about, and really clears up misconceptions that I've had in the past, and I'm sure that many of our listeners have had. So super awesome that you came on. I was really excited. A little bummed out that we had to push it to this week instead of last week, but good things come to those who wait. So thanks for coming on. And it was a fantastic episode. So if you like this kind of stuff, Masonic podcasts, of course, I do Whence Came You. It's 9:30 Sunday nights. And we've got Midnight Freemason articles that go up all the time, midnightfreemasons.com. And we do Masonic Curators, a new YouTube show. I would like submissions. We just had a really great one coming from Australia. Brother David Connolly showed off his Masonic razor collection. So pretty neat. If you've got some cool stuff laying around that you just love and want to show other people, send a video over here and we'll put it out. So that's it. Thanks very much. And that's all I got. Mike
the intern.
So yeah, I'll just reiterate a little bit of RJ's statement there. I love it when Eric comes on because I've learned a lot from Eric over the years, just listening to X-Oriente. And to be honest with you, I can't get enough of one, of his podcast. So, because I actually go back and listen to a lot of the old episodes over again. So, but anyway, this episode in particular, though, I actually found quite interesting. I really felt over my head when I was even reading about it, but actually having listened to more about it, I've actually picked up on it and really get it better now. So, just a quick shout out to Jack Aquilina for finally doing another show of the Brought to Light podcast. And good night, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Brother Eric Diamond, take us home.
You guys are making me blush. I'm a huge fan. Not just in my feelings, but in sheer body mass. I just, shameless plug, X-Oriente most Sunday nights. My New Year's resolution is to be on a more regular schedule. I like nothing better than a good Masonic conversation. So if you see me at Masonic Week, feel free to, sit me down and ply me with a whiskey and don't be shy, because I love these kinds of discussions, and to me it's what Masonry is all about. And I think that what you guys are doing is amazing. I think you make Masonry accessible to to a lot of people, especially beginners. I mean, sometimes we forget, when we get to be like old grizzled past masters, that the people who are coming into this, who are starving for knowledge, and maybe they're not getting it in their lodge, they rely on us more so than books, more so than written books. They rely on us week in and week out to help them navigate in a way that is not dogmatic, but gives them the tools and the ability to sort of discover Masonry for themselves. And so I applaud you guys for doing it. And it's funny. They wrote my little blurb for the Masonic Society dinner, and they said that I was the granddaddy of Masonic podcasting. And if that's true, father maybe, granddaddy, what can I say? Yes, I'm old, but if that's true, I'm so proud that that this experiment that we started over a decade ago has yielded so many amazing podcasts, of which you guys are probably at the top of the heap. So thank you for doing what you guys do, and thank you always for having me. I love being on the show. So thank you. I'm not worthy.
Oh, shucks. You're making us blush, Eric. Yeah, I remember it was 3 years ago at Masonic Week. I think John Rourke and I had just gotten to the hotel, and we just kind of sat down in our suits, and there's this guy just walking calmly toward us. I'm like, who the hell is this guy? And he sat down, and he's like, "Are you John and Jason? I'm Eric Diamond." And that's and you've been the only reason I go to Masonic Week every single year since. So now I'll have to go because of Jason Van Dyke as well.
Yeah.
But I can like go to Lodge in DC and see him too. So
yeah,
a little more special. But thanks so much for coming on, Eric. You are just a fountain of knowledge, especially when it comes to Kabbalistic interpretation and Masonic research. So it's anytime you can share a smidgen of your knowledge with us, we're very humbled and grateful.
Thank you. Always happy to.
So this was an awesome episode. This is an episode I've been looking forward to for a long time because I love doing Masonic research. And I love looking beyond the veneer of just kind of what's on the page, looking at the deeper historical context behind what's going on, and then looking at allegorical and mystical meanings. So anytime that we can delve into research methods really gets my inner history major going. from 15 years ago. So really, really great episode. The key here for everybody watching is that when you're doing Masonic research, try to do it to the best of your ability. You don't have to know everything, but you do have to know something, and you really need to do your homework before you just extrapolate to the nth degree. And there are historical research methods like the Pardes Exegesis method that can help you do that. And so, take a look. Read Scott Duball's article on the Midnight Freemasons, and look into other historical and other research methods before you start going and working on a research project. But the most important thing you can do is actually start that research, because the topics aren't going to research themselves, and Masonry provides really a completely unfettered access to just about every topic under the sun as far as research goes. So there's so much in this fraternity, even tangentially related, that you can research and do exposition on. And we're very, very blessed to be part of an organization that draws from so many different cultures and has such a rich heritage. So with that, thanks so much for coming and spending time with us. We'll be back next week. Thank you for watching, and keep searching for more light.